Our scripture this morning comes from 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 14. You may follow along as it's written in your bulletin. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man and in high favor with his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man, though a mighty warrior, suffered from leprosy. Now the Arameans, on one of their raids, had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, "Go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel." He went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy." When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to give death or life, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Just look and see how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the entrance of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became angry and went away, saying, "I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" He turned and went away in a rage. But his servants approached and said to him, "Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. May God bless our hearing of these sacred texts.
I will not forget my first opportunity to preach on a Christmas Eve. My vocational journey sent me down the path of being a youth minister and then an associate minister, and so Christmas Eve is typically reserved for the senior minister to preach. And finally, the day came when I would get my swing at it. And my first Christmas Eve sermon was bigger than Bethlehem itself. I recall going big And I asked my friend about 3 days later, what did you think? And he very honestly, with a little bit of sarcasm, shared back with me, Mark, you outpreached Christmas Eve itself. He then shared with me, instead of going for a home run, you should have just tried to get on base and let God get him in. And I recall that there was such, in that moment of preparation, a desire for whatever it was that I was going to say to be spectacular. For we all have a penchant for that which is spectacular. I mean, consider, for those of you who may have seen some fireworks over the weekend, what your most anticipated part of the fireworks display was. It was, of course, the grand finale. For any firework display has to be spectacular. And then really and truly, when it comes to our faith, there are so many occasions in both the Old Testament and the New Testament when God moves in and through the spectacular to bless others. And so you really can't blame Naaman for wanting his healing to be spectacular. For we walk into a classic Old Testament story this morning, the story of Naaman the Syrian, and it's a story that really gets overlooked. Perhaps for two reasons. The first is that it's lodged in 2 Kings in the Hebrew Bible. And the second reason is that the story really does challenge our sentiments. That if God's going to work, then whatever God does is going to have to be spectacular. For the story of Naaman really is a journey from the spectacular to the simple. You'll recall it, Naaman is struggling with leprosy, and so initially he desires for God to help him and to heal him, and his desire really is like Sharon's beginning to the pastoral prayer. If I'm going to be healed of leprosy, then surely there's going to be some kind of earthquake or divine intervention. God's outstretched hand is going to reach down from heaven and heal me of this. But that's not what happens. Instead, God sends a servant girl from a slave family to tell him to go see a prophet. Some scholars believe that the servant girl may have been as young as 8 years old. Not so spectacular. So Naaman, in his desire for his healing to be big and spectacular, takes his horses, his chariots, all of his men with him. He was a decorated war general, and he goes off to the home of the prophet, where he says, surely the prophet's going to meet me there, and wave his hand over the spot, abracadabra spectacular, in front of the masses. But the prophet does not do this. Instead, he sends to Naaman a lowly messenger. Well, Naaman at this point is frustrated because he still wants God to intervene in some kind of spectacular way. And surely, if I'm going to be healed, it's going to be in the Abana River or the Pharpar River. These two rivers, the Greeks used to refer to as golden rivers. They were pristine. The Jordan River, it was muddy. A ministry colleague this week, she was doing a lectionary blog, and she posted on her blog, she said, imagine in wanting to be healed, God saying to Naaman, Naaman, instead of going to the crystal clear turquoise waters of Siesta Key Chapel in Sarasota, you're going to go instead to Lake Okeechobee. And Naaman finally, in this moment, the text really crescendos in verse 13. If you had been asked to do something difficult or spectacular, would you not have done it? And Naaman comes to the realization that maybe, just maybe, God will work in and through the simple. He goes to the simple, muddy waters of the Jordan River, and he is healed. Faith without all the fireworks. What this text encourages me to reflect upon is that maybe there are times in my walk and life of faith where God is going to work in and through the spectacular, But Naaman's story teaches me that there will be other times in my life of faith where God will work in and through the simple, and in and through that which might even be small. Was watching the news this past week where there was a woman in her early 60s, and she was very enthusiastic about standing in faith in the community for something that she thought was relatively unfair. And a news reporter was interviewing her about her desire to be good. And she shared back with the news reporter the story about the starfish that I shared with the children this morning. And she said, you know, my parents shared with me that story when I was young, and now I'm 62 years old. And there are days when I'm doing good and wanting to be a person of faith where it just feels like I'm throwing one or two starfish back into the ocean. But then she made a comment that was rather wise. She said, but you know what? God works in and through that small stuff too. Faith, without all the fireworks. Years ago, I recall reading a wonderful book by Henry Cloud and John Townsend on boundaries in the Christian life, including boundaries on a service and loving others with needs. And in that book, Cloud and Townsend were talking about boundaries and made a really astute comment as it related to our desire to be the Good Samaritan. He said, you know, the greatest temptation to not being the Good Samaritan is the pressure we will often put on ourselves to be the Great Samaritan. There is no Great Samaritan in the Bible, he shared. Sometimes we can become so disconcerted about that which we can't do that we give up on that which we can do. What if God can move in and through that which is simple and that which is small to bring forth something rather powerful in our lives and in the lives of others? Or put another way, for those of you who have never heard of Naaman the Syrian, you may have heard of him in and around the pandemic that we just endured throughout the world. For Naaman became what some would refer to as the pandemic faith hero. It's in part because he had leprosy, a disease that was contagious. And it's also in part because Naaman was willing to embrace that which was simple. And when he did, God met him in and through that simplicity. And in reading an article about this years ago, there was a message that was written by an author that was simply along the lines of, you know, one day our lives will return to that which is complex and spectacular again. But will we remember the ways in which God works in and through the simple? Will we remember that? Simple acts of love, simple acts of faith. What if sometimes our journey is without all the fireworks? I'll close this morning with a final observation and illustration that I think works perfectly in the context of this story of Naaman the Syrian, who was finally willing to put aside the spectacular to honor that God would work in and through the simple to touch him and to touch his life. And it's a story that a wonderful preacher by the name of Fred Craddock tells about the Christian life. And it is so true, and it hits home for me. He says that so often in our lives of faith, we make believe that the Christian life is like God handing us a $1,000 bill. And then our job is to take that $1,000 bill and to bring it to the communion table and to hand it over to God all at once. And Craddock, in reflecting on this, says, really, when you consider the Christian life and its journey, it's more like God giving you a $1,000 bill and then asking you to go to the bank and exchange it for quarters. And every day, you live a life 25 cents at a time. One small prayer, one small moment of trust, one small afternoon volunteering, one small gift, one small act of kindness. Faith, said Craddock, happens 25 cents at a time. I sense that if we were to ask Naaman to end this message and come back from the Jordan River and to encourage all of us in our faithfulness going forward, I sense that he would end it this way. Keep putting your quarter in.